I first discovered this bread when I found a YouTube video by New York Times food editor and author of How to Cook Everything, Mark Bittman, featuring Jim Lahey and his no-knead bread method. The best way I can describe to you how much I enjoy making this bread is by reading part of the Amazon review I wrote for Jim Lahey's book, My Bread, almost 5 years ago. Back on January the 9th, 2010, I wrote, "For a long time I dreamed of creating bread that would be like a loaf you'd buy in a real bakery, the kind of bread I used to eat growing up in South Philadelphia. When this book arrived from Amazon, I could not stop reading it. Waiting to bake my first loaf, I was like a kid on Christmas morning. I was filled with anticipation. I always wondered how to replicate the crust that I love so much. Jim's Dutch oven trick is the ticket to creating the steam needed for the excellent crust. The bread came out better than I expected. It was amazing. It was simple, and the bread turned out simply awesome. Thank you, Jim Lahey, for sharing this with the world. You have inspired millions." Okay, we're going to start out by making the bread with 4 cups of bread flour. I'm using King Arthur's bread flour, but you could use any bread flour that you would like, or you could even use all-purpose flour. When I make the round loaves of bread, I generally use the bread flour, and I'm not sure why, but when I make the flatter loaves of bread, I usually use all-purpose flour. Typically whatever you have on hand. So we're going to put 4 cups of flour in the glass bowl. I always use a glass bowl, and for this recipe I don't measure anything. I just eyeball it the best that I could, scoop and shake. And then we're going to use a half a teaspoon of instant yeast. We're going to put that in the flour, and then we're going to use 2 teaspoons of table salt. I always use table salt when I make the bread dough for whatever reason. And then we're going to mix that. I'm using a whisk here to mix that real good, make sure all the dry ingredients are mixed really well before we add the water. The water that I use is just 2 cups of tap water at room temperature. I'm going to pour the 2 cups of water in the bowl. I use a rubber spatula to mix the dough. Some people use a wooden spoon, and they'll mix it very quickly and just cover it. I actually start by scraping the bowl from around the edges and then incorporating that into the center. You want to just try to mix that the best that you could. You're probably going to have some dry ingredients, some of the flour still kind of stuck to the edges of the bowl. Don't worry about that. When the time comes that the dough rests, it all kind of works its way in there. So you're going to mix this the best that you can. And then we're going to cover it with just some plastic wrap. You'll find the dough is very sticky because of the water, the amount of water that's in the dough. You don't want to touch it with your hands because it'll just get messy. I usually use the back of a butter knife, you know, the non-sharp section of the butter knife, just to scrape the excess dough off the back of the spatula there as I'm mixing it. You're going to cover this with plastic wrap. You want to cover it nice and tight. You don't want any air getting in there, because then it'll form a skin on the dough, and you're not going to want that. So just cover it the best that you can, and we're going to put it in a place that's room temperature, and it's going to sit on the countertop for 18 to 24 hours before we get on to the next step. I'm just doubling over the plastic wrap here just to be sure. That's not really necessary. I have the bread dough here after the 18 to 24 hours. So we're gonna scrape out the dough here onto a nice floured work surface. This is very sticky. Just do the best you can pulling this out. You really might want to pick up one of these bowl scrapers. It makes it a lot easier. to get this wet dough out of the bowl. Just trying to get any other bits. Okay. I also have a bench scraper here, which I'm going to use in a second. We're just going to sprinkle a little flour on the dough, make sure there's enough flour on our hands, and just quickly push this dough out, flatten this dough. We're going to fold it over on itself here in just a second. So we're going to use the bench scraper. Fold this over. Fold over the other side. So you get a little more flour here. Fold into one side. This doesn't have to be perfect. Just do the best you could. See the seam? The seam is up here. Just going to flour this a little bit more. Okay, I have a skillet, and then inside the skillet, or on top of the skillet, I have a silicone mat. These mats work really well when you're trying to make this dough rise. The wet dough tends to stick to anything, even if you use cloth with cornmeal or flour, which I do a lot as well. But the silicone really is good for first time people doing this. It'll save you some aggravation with the dough sticking. So I'm going to just sprinkle a little bit of flour here in the inside of the mat. I like the flour on the bread since it's baking. So we're just going to lift this up. Okay, we're going to put the seam side down in the mat here, or on the mat. Sprinkle a little more flour, and we're going to cover this with a cotton cloth. I have a cotton cloth here that we use for covering it with dough. Just going to fold it over because it's fairly large. We're just going to let that sit. It's kind of difficult to cover with plastic wrap at this point, so that's why we just do this to kind of keep the air off of it. You don't want any kind of a skin or anything forming on the top of the dough. Okay, we're going to let that sit a couple of hours, and then we'll be back to bake it. Alright, so I have a cast iron pot here, a Lodge cast iron pot that I had preheating in the oven for 30 minutes. My oven's set on 500 degrees, and when I had the dough rising for the second time, I preheated the oven to 500 degrees, and I had put the pot in here once it hit temperature, preheated the pot for 30 minutes. You want that blazing hot. So I have here the dough after the second rise. What I like to do at this point is I put cornmeal. I put a liberal amount of cornmeal on it because you don't want this sticking to the bottom of the pot. Even though the pot's well seasoned, there's been times when I've had it almost stick, so I always put a nice liberal amount of cornmeal here on the bottom of the dough. Be really careful when you take the lid off the pot. This pot right now is blazing hot. I have it sitting on a granite countertop, which is fine. You can put that directly on stone, but if you have Formica countertop or a wood countertop, you want to put something there that's going to insulate that and not burn your countertop. Okay, so what I want to do here, it might be a little messy here for a minute, but I'm going to pick the bottom of the silicone mat up. I'm going to flip that right in the bottom of the pot. So what was on top is now on the bottom of the pot. Okay. Put the lid back on. I'm going to put this in the oven for 30 minutes. Alright, it's been 30 minutes. I'm going to pull the cast iron pot out of the oven, take the lid off. We're going to see what the bread looks like. Again, I got this right on my granite here, but if you have wood or another surface, just be careful because this pot is blazing hot. Yeah, you can see the top of the dough, of the bread, is real nice. So we are going to pop this back in the oven for another 10 or 15 minutes, or until you get the color that you want. Okay, taking it out of the pot, I'm just using a wooden bamboo spoon. We're going to put it on a rack here. It's very hot. We're going to let that cool. I'm going to take the hot pot. Since this is really hot, somebody can get burned pretty bad with this. I'm just going to go sit this over on my stove so that nobody wants to touch it. And after we cut it, we'll be back and take a look. Alright, the round loaf of bread is cooled off. You can see the cornmeal that I had put on it earlier that then was the bottom of the bread. So we're going to cut into this, see how it looks. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. There are literally hundreds of no-knead bread recipes out there and many videos on YouTube. Once you try one, you will be hooked. Sharing this video and bread with you is more than just sharing a recipe. For me, making this bread brings back childhood memories from the neighborhood bakery. Stay tuned for future videos.